Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Got a nice crowd. My name is Sharon Bassi. I work in the Office of Sustainability, and we've brought together experts here today to discuss climate change and politics. Really quick, I'm going to put a plug in for our sign-in sheet. So if you get a chance, please fill that out. Some pointers on Zoom etiquette. Your camera is optional, but encouraged. Keep in mind that this event is being recorded and may be posted to our YouTube for future reference. So really quickly, why don't we go around the panel and introduce ourselves, just your name, job title, and what you do. Professor Wing, can you get us started?
Sure. I'm Laura Wing. I am a professor of political science in the political science department. I teach a lot of public law classes, including environmental law. Dr. Bello?
Professor Bello.
Oh, hi, I'm Dr. Amy Balo. I'm assistant professor in political science, and I teach primarily international relations classes and some environmental classes.
Professor Lam?
Hi, everyone. My name is Juleen Lam. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Health Sciences, but starting next semester, it will actually be called the Department of Public Health. I teach environmental health classes, environmental health policy classes, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about climate change.
All right, viewers, if you have any questions at any point during the presentations, feel free to input them in the chat, but although they might be answered as we go along, I might just save them for the Q&A at the end, so keep that in mind. Let's get right into it. Professor Wing, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Give me a moment to pull up my slides.
No worries.
Okay. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be doing a comparison of the Trump and Biden administrations and the actions they've taken toward environmental protections. And I want to start off by making it clear that presidents have vast powers to affect U.S. policy toward the environment, and they have vast powers that include acting unilaterally, and that's coming from their power to issue executive orders to direct their agencies to do or not do something, as well as powers relating to their ability to sign and negotiate treaties. So let's take a look at, actually 1 second, I want to go back. I wanted to make clear that President Trump, while he was in office, he created or made over 100 changes that rolled back environmental protections. And really, he really prioritized business concerns over environmental protections. And then Biden, when he came into office, he wanted to change that. And so he issued this executive order on his first day in office, really just a few hours after he was sworn in. And basically what it says is it set his priorities. It said that his administration is going to prioritize environmental protections, and any decisions that they make are going to be based in the science. And then he said to that end, as you can see in this lower portion here, to that end, he directed all of his agencies to review all decisions made in the past 4 years. So not calling out Trump by name, but obviously calling out Trump, and saying they're going to review all those rollbacks that Trump made. And to the extent that they don't align with environmental protections or making decisions based in science, they were going to make changes. So what I want to do for the remainder of this presentation is just highlight a few of those changes that have been made. So let's start by looking at what both presidents did with the Keystone XL pipeline. So the Keystone XL pipeline, part of it was an existing pipeline. As you can see in this solid line here, it moved fossil fuels from the US to Canada. And in the first 10 years of that pipeline's existence, it spilled 12 times. So that was always a real threat. So when the XL pipeline was proposed, which is going to be an extension, as you can see on this dotted line here, when that was proposed, Obama put a stop to it because it required a permit to cross the US and Canadian border. Obama put a stop to it. However, when Trump came into office on his first day in office, he revoked that and he granted a permit, signed an executive order granting a permit so this pipeline could be built. And he said it's, to promote jobs, energy infrastructure, but really it was, promotion of using fossil fuel energy. Biden campaigned against that. So on Biden's first day in office, he revoked that permit. And his reasons for doing so is because there is such a potential for spills. Spills happen more than once a year on this pipeline. This pipeline carries a particularly dirty type of fossil fuel, and it really threatened a lot of these environmentally significant areas that it would traverse through, as well as the fact that many indigenous communities live near or adjacent to these pipelines. So their communities were especially threatened by the creation of the pipeline. So this is no longer going forward. All right, let's look at the Migratory Bird Treaty Act 1918. So what this was a congressional act that implemented aspects of several treaties between the US, Canada, Mexico that protected migratory birds. It made it illegal to accidentally or purposefully kill migratory birds. It's the biggest, most important bird protection law that exists. It was uncontroversial and existed for over 100 years, or about 100 years. Trump came into office, and within his first year of office, he changed his administration's interpretation of that and said that people who incidentally or accidentally kill birds are not going to be held liable under this act. Biden came around, and then just last month, they changed that and they went back to the original interpretation of the act, so that accidental killings will be again considered illegal. And just to give you an idea of what this means, if you think back to the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico just over 10 years ago or so, there were hundreds of thousands of birds that were accidentally killed as a result of that oil spill, and BP was able to be held accountable. Now, had something like that happened while Trump's interpretation was still the law, no one would have been held accountable for that. But now the law has been reverted to what it was for a century. Okay, moving on. So let's look at the waters of the United States, or what we call WOTUS rules. So this is all about the applicability of the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is a federal act, congressional act, that helps prevent water pollution and punish polluters. It applies to all navigable waters in the United States, so meaning like really just waters that you can float a boat on and bring boats on. So it applies to our rivers, our bays, and most lakes. But what was always unclear under the Clean Water Act is its applicability to wetlands. So swamps or marshes, or things like you see in the picture here. Things that really aren't navigable, but they do have a connection to navigable waters. And obviously pollutants that go into wetlands are going to seep into and connect to navigable waters. So it was never clear whether the Clean Water Act applied to that. The Supreme Court attempted to answer that question in Rapinos versus the United States, is a case I heard in, I think it was 2006, but they didn't come to a majority conclusion. There's a plurality opinion split between about half the judges siding with Justice Scalia and half the justices siding with Justice Kennedy. So we have no clear rule here. So it was then left to presidents to direct their administration about the waters rule and the Clean Waters Act. So it was up to the POTUS to determine the WOTUS rules. So Obama was the first president to pass a WOTUS rule, and he sided with Kennedy's opinion, which basically said whenever you can show a clear or a significant nexus, a significant connection between a non-navigable wetland and a navigable body of water, the Clean Water Act will apply. So that gives a lot of power to Congress to protect wetlands. Trump came in and in 2020 changed that policy and said, we're going to go and side with what Justice Scalia said, which was that there had to be basically a permanent wetland that had continuous surface water. So a lot of these wetlands dry up for part of the year. And so under Trump's interpretation, those wetlands would not be protected in the Clean Water Act, meaning people would not, the Clean Water Act wouldn't apply, so people could pollute those or fill in those wetlands and build a mall or housing on top of it. Biden came in, and this is still pending, but something that they are working on will come out soon, is reverting back to the Obama era rules, or what follows with Justice Kennedy, saying as long as you can say that there's some sort of connection, the water doesn't have to exist year round, but as long as you can see that there's a significant connection between the two, the Clean Water Act will apply. And the last example that I want to go over is to talk about national monuments, particularly these two, the Grand Staircase-Escalante and the Bears Ears National Monument. These national monuments both are in Utah. And if you're not clear what a national monument is or versus a national park, let me give you a really short explanation. National monuments are federally owned land that are permanently set aside, or they're set aside so that there'll be no more development in that area. And national monuments will apply to set aside any historically significant area like the Gettysburg Field or anything that is of scientific value. And so under the Antiquities Act, presidents have the power basically unilaterally through an executive order to create these national monuments. And they're similar to, but not the exact same thing as a national park. National parks have to be created by an act of Congress and can be created for other reasons. But a lot of times, national monuments are created and then they'll be later made into a national park. But this grand staircase, and this is a grand staircase over here. This is the Bears Ears over here. They were in existence. The Trump administration came in and they greatly reduced the size of these two monuments. They reduced the size of the grand staircase monument by about 50% and cut the size of the Bears Ears monument by 85%. So in total, they cut about over 2 million acres, meaning that those 2 million acres were no longer protected, and meaning that developers could come in and develop the land. So they're no longer set aside as wildlife refuges and all the values that it represents. I do want to note that Trump's legal authority to do so is questionable. The Antiquities Act says that presidents can create these monuments by executive order, but it doesn't say anything about reducing the size. And so that was an unanswered legal question. But he did it. Anyway, Biden came in. Biden is changing it. And just last week, they said they're coming out like literally any day now with a decision on this. They're going to restore those monuments to the original size and possibly might even increase the size of them. And I just want to close by just reiterating, the Biden administration is currently reviewing all of those rollbacks on environmental protection that Trump did. Again, there were over 100 rollbacks. And so Biden's administration is looking at them one by one and taking action on pretty much all of them, as well as considering additional federal environmental protections. And again, just to reiterate, you can see that these two administrations took vastly different approaches. Trump, again, always pushing the pro-development, pro-business platform, whereas Biden, it's his policies to protect the environment based on scientific purposes. And both presidents have vast, vast powers to do so. And with that, I'm going to conclude my portion of the presentation, and I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Bello next. And let me just stop sharing my screen.
All right, does that look good on your end? Fantastic. Okay, so thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and focus more on the international aspects of climate politics, environmental politics, but obviously still with that continuing thread of the Biden administration and what that administration is doing differently from the Trump years. What I wanted to start off with was a quick little background context for everyone to see how we got to where we are. And I wanted to highlight 4 of the primary big international agreements about climate change. The first one was back in 1992, excuse me, at the Rio Earth Summit. It is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And why I really bring this up is this is the umbrella agreement under which all the other agreements and treaties since fall under. And this is important when I talk about later when the U.S. has signed on and when the U.S. has not signed on. But essentially it got all countries in the world to sign on because it was very loose. It didn't really require any specific emission reductions from any countries, but everyone agreed that climate change was something that needed to be addressed. Then the next major agreement that most of you have probably heard of is the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. What this did, a lot of scholars say, it gave teeth to the Framework Convention. So what it basically did is legally required industrialized, developed countries that have more of the historic emissions and that have the capability to reduce emissions, that they had to reduce their emissions by a certain percentage by a certain time. So this was the first time that some countries were held to legal requirements to reduce greenhouse gases. But that treaty only has a certain lifespan. Most treaties are not perpetual, they don't run forever, they have an ending period. And so they knew that end was coming up around 2015. So in 2019, the world came together again, even though they do all the years in between. So by 2009, there was an attempt to have a replacement. It didn't work, but they had what became known as the Copenhagen Accord, which again, didn't have too many teeth to it. It was kind of a weaker agreement, but what it did do is said, okay, now we think all countries need to step forward and make some type of reduction, but we're not requiring it at this point. No, it's not legally binding. By 2015, we get the Paris Climate Accord, which will be the focus of the rest of what I'll talk about today. And this was the replacement. So the idea is it replaces the Paris Accord and is the new kind of overarching climate change agreement. I want to go back through time and look at how the U.S. specifically was involved in these. So in the first, we have President George Herbert Walker Bush, and he signed he made the U.S. a signatory, and actually in the U.S. system of government, any international treaty has to be ratified by our U.S. Senate, and the Senate ratified it. The U.S. is a member, which is very important again, because it's that overarching umbrella agreement. Because come 1997 and the Kyoto Protocol, President Clinton was able to sign, but could not get the Senate to ratify. So Democrats and Republicans voted 95-0. We will not ratify this. You cannot join this. So the U.S. was a signatory, but not an official member, but because it's still a member of that framework, could still keep going to conferences and keep having a say. By the time we get to the Copenhagen Accord, the rest of the international community knows that the US has a problem with ratifying some of these agreements. So they change it a little bit. And now no country is specifically required to reduce by a specific amount, but every country will be asked to voluntarily make commitments. So partly because of this, then Obama can sign on. No Senate ratification needed. The U.S. is a member to the Copenhagen Accord. Same thing happens with the Paris Climate Accord. We don't need the Senate's ratification, so Obama signs up to it. It was partly by design because they knew that the U.S. Senate probably wouldn't ratify, but just as easily as Obama can join, the next president can leave. So as soon as Trump takes office, he says, nope, we're out, we're leaving. There was a mandatory waiting period, but essentially the world knew the US was out. So I just wanted to use this graphic of the US leaving, right? The Paris Accord, which essentially left the US as the only country. At one point, Syria was not a signatory. It was embroiled in a civil war. It later signed. Nicaragua did not sign, largely a protest, arguing that the agreement was too weak, but it later signed, and that left the United States as the only country not a signatory. What did the Accord actually say? Pretty vague language. It says that each party, so each country, shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive nationally determined contributions that it intends to achieve. These are called the NDCs. Essentially, each country comes up with its own reductions and how much you're going to reduce by what time, and they submit that. That would then become legally binding. But there's limited enforcement. It's always hard to, in international relations, to force countries to do much of anything. It's one of the biggest challenges. So it was officially binding, but places no specific restrictions on any particular country. So it was both lauded and criticized. One, that it eventually got all countries on board, committing to some sort of attention and reduction, but on the flip side, these were only promises that countries were making, and it wasn't anything really strong. And this was part of the criticism of Trump removing the US, was the US hadn't actually committed to anything that the US hadn't decided on its own. But regardless, Trump didn't want to be a part of it. So when Biden comes into office, one of the first things he does is sign an executive order to get the US back as a member of the Paris Accord. So a big change, a signature heard around the world. Another really prominent thing he did was name a special climate envoy in former Secretary of State Kerry. Interesting note about Kerry is he was Secretary of State when the US signed the Paris Accord. He, as Secretary of State, went to the UN and signed on the behalf of the country, and he brought his granddaughter with him to do so. So in his new role now, he's only been in office a couple months. Just this past week, he's visited his counterparts in China and South Korea to try to get more support and agreement from other countries, particularly China and the other major emitter, to take more steps to move climate protection forwards. Previous to that, he visited India, Bangladesh, and the United Arab Emirates, and like everyone else, he's doing his job online as well. So he's had a number of other meetings with other world leaders, climate diplomats around the world. All of this leading up to what's happening later this week is what Biden had said he would do when he was campaigning, was hold a climate leaders summit in Washington. So this is actually happening later this week. He timed it specifically for Earth Day and for Earth Week. It's virtual, right? COVID. So everyone is attending virtually, but the idea is to bring some of the biggest emitters and then some other countries that aren't large emitters, but are taking on leadership roles in the climate regime, with the idea of moving forward. Outlook in terms of where we go with this under the new presidency, in some ways I'm very optimistic. We're getting the US on board being a major emitter back at the table that could help reduce emissions. It's bringing another leader back to the table. This idea of this climate diplomacy, Kerry, going from country to country, sometimes bilateral or small mini-lateral agreements are actually more effective than having everyone sign on to a big treaty. Another thing is this time period is really important. 2021, we're in this pandemic. Is there a way we can build back up from the pandemic greener? That could be an opportunity. On the flip side, I'm also a little pessimistic. The US has a lot of trust to rebuild. The nature of our presidencies, right? You have a president for 4, maybe 8 years, they leave office. The international community doesn't know who's coming next. There's no way to know that another president could just step back the way Trump did. So there's not a lot of continuity and there's not a lot of trust built in. So there's a long ways that we have to go with that. These nationally determined contributions, assessments now state that they are not enough. They're not going to, if all countries meet what they've even promised to do, which is not likely, we'll still go above, and I think Professor Lam might talk about this more, the 2-degree increase that we're hoping to prevent beyond, and it certainly won't get us to the 1.5 degree. We're looking more at 3 or 4 or above. And for many domestic obstacles in every country, including our own, that will be hard to meet. Funding from more industrialized countries to global South countries is paltry. Promises were not being met. Biden was even criticized, I think, this week for pledging more than he's actually given. And then I'll say timing also could be pretty bad, right? That in this 2021 pandemic, it's hard to say that a lot of countries have priorities elsewhere, and it's a lot to have to kind of rebuild from the pandemic in a greener way. But all of this is leaning towards the next conference of the parties. Like I said, every year, the next one will be in Glasgow, and all of what Biden and Kerry are doing are trying to lead up to that next conference with the hopes that they can kind of push forward next steps into 2022. Okay, I will leave with that, and I will unshare my screen and pass off to Dr. Lam.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just get this all set up. And then sorry, I'm going to try this again. I need to swap this, I think. Is that working? Do you see all the slides or the whole slide? No. How about now?
Yes.
Now? Haha, okay. I got it figured out. Okay. So thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here to cap off this wonderful panel session. So thanks to Drs. Bello and Wing for getting us kicked off with the political climate. I'm glad that they went first to kind of set the stage for what has happened in the past four years, and then kind of the hope for where we are headed now. So I think it is safe to say that we all know about climate change and we recognize its very real and threatening effects. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is an intergovernmental body of the United Nations that's really seen as the authoritative source on evaluating and summarizing scientific evidence regarding climate change. In 2014, they concluded that the scientific evidence is solid. It's there, it's supporting that the climate is warming, it's indisputable, and more importantly, that human influence is really the dominant cause. Now, supporting that is that really decisive statement by IPCC is the fact that there's this whole host of climate-related effects that we have witnessed occurring with greater frequency and increasing intensity, either where we live, for instance, we're seeing a lot more wildfires that are happening with more frequent occurrence, as well as higher severity. And we're seeing these same things around the United States and really around the world. And all the data is really there. So the title of my talk is thinking about the science behind climate change, but really I'm going to focus a little bit on science, basically this one slide here, just because there's so much science. I mean, I could really spend this whole hour, if not an entire semester, and indeed we do have a whole climate change class that we teach in the Department of Health Sciences, where we look through this data. And basically there's data to support all of those effects that we are seeing with the climate warming. We have the data there. It's supporting the fact that we are reaching, if not surpassing, a breaking point where really it's kind of the point of no return. So we know that the data is there. We know that it is decisive. We know that the climate is warming. And to sum it all up, as the IPCC said, the scientific evidence is there and it's unequivocal. And yet, even with all that data and the scientific consensus that currently exists, there still actually remains a lot of doubt. So you might ask yourself, really, people still deny climate change? Is this really just a handful of deniers, or is this really a wide-scale problem? So I think someone's going to help me out here with a poll that we have for you all. So this is possibly the easiest quiz that you'll ever take here at Cal State East Bay. So if this poll pops up on your screen, it's going to ask you to complete this sentence. So global climate change is a major threat, a minor threat, or not a threat to our country.
Carol, can you launch that poll? I don't have. Hold on, let me see if I can pull it up. Well, I'm not able to launch the poll, so why don't we do a 1, 2, 3 share in the chat?
We can do that. All right. Oh, I think it just popped up for me.
Okay, yes, just kidding. It's there. Please go ahead, participate.
Okay, so go ahead and vote. And then I'll just give you all 15 seconds because this should be relatively easy. And then Carol, if you want to close the poll, and then if you could share it and then we can see the results, that would be great. Okay. All right, consensus. So 100% of those who voted said that climate change seems to be a major threat to our country. Okay, great. Now, what does the rest of the United States and the rest of the world say? So the Pew Research Center has conducted this survey a few times now. And last year, the most recently in 2020, they asked this exact question to 14,000 people over 14 different countries. And so the good news is the majority of people in each country do see global climate change as a major threat. So that's good. But the bad news is the United States lags behind other countries. So only 62%, which is below the country median, which is at 70%, think that climate change is a major threat to our country. Now, this is important because it indicates that we still have a lot of work to do, because 14% of people in our country still believe that global climate change doesn't pose a threat to our country. That might not seem like a lot, 14%, but remember, 14% of 330 million people is a whole lot of people. And with 46 million people who still believe that climate change is not a threat to our country, this really stalls efforts to make headway on addressing this issue in any real significant sort of way. But the good news is that not everybody feels the same way. So this may not be surprising to you all, but those individuals who may have higher levels of education, who are younger, who are female, or who affiliate or lean towards democratic voting tendencies, tend to view climate change as a serious problem. So when we polled you all here, not surprisingly, the general sentiment kind of falls along those same lines, because this reflects many of the characteristics of individuals here in State East Bay. And also, even better news, you might say, that these numbers have been steadily increasing over time. So for instance, in the United States, you may be kind of shocked and dismayed to see that only 62% of individuals think climate change pose a major threat, but only a decade ago, this percentage was only about 45%. So slowly but surely we're coming around, and it's not just us, it's basically every other country. So this number has been slowly increasing over time. Now, all that data that I showed you very quickly earlier has been around for more than a decade. Scientists have been working on climate change for several decades now. So what's really starting to help people come around? Well, one important factor is when people can actually see the effects of climate change. So one example, and hopefully this works here, but I'm fully prepared for me to have technological issues and for it not to work, but I have two videos here that I'm going to try to play, which is part of Google Earth. So Google Earth just released this thing called time lapse last week, and it compiles millions of images taken over decades to illustrate how our landscapes around the world have been changing from the effects of climate change. And this is really one of the most impactful ways to convince people. So having them visually see the effects of climate change and also potentially seeing its impacts if this is an area where you live or where you've visited before is really important. And this is unfortunately really human nature, right? So for most people, they really only start caring when it starts to affect them personally. So here's a couple of examples. I'll hold my breath here and see if this works. Okay, so this is the first example from Google Time-Lapse, this top one that hopefully you're seeing change. This is an example showing coastal erosion in North Carolina, where the beach shores are literally eroding away and disappearing. And this is such a big problem that there was actually a lighthouse that was located on kind of the tip of this beach, and the city had to spend $12 million to move the lighthouse a few thousand feet inland onto the shore to prevent it from falling into the ocean. So that's one example where you can see this erosion happening. And this next example down here. Okay, so this is from Alaska, where the glaciers are melting and receding away, and again, literally just disappearing. So when people can see these effects, whether it's because they see local effects where they live, so for instance, I mentioned in California, these wildfires that we're seeing and physically kind of living through, or if they can see areas that are familiar to them and seeing these change, this can have really powerful impacts for how they start to view climate change. And this is part of the reason why I think public sentiment is starting to change, just with more availability of kind of these visual images, which can do a lot more than a graph or a table of data can actually do. So the good news is that people are starting to care. More people are caring, more people are kind of believing in climate change and starting to take action. They're standing up and making their voices heard. So what can you do? Well, there's lots of things that you can do. There's hundreds, literally hundreds of things that you can do. And I think we've all probably heard these things before. So driving less, taking public transit more, eating less red meat. And each of these has various impacts on the problem. So for instance, research has shown that if you give up your car and live carless, that can have a really significant impact on reducing your carbon emissions versus things like planting a tree, which obviously still has an impact, but a much smaller one. But the important thing to note is that all of these actions contribute in some way to reducing the impacts of climate change. But you might ask yourself, well, does this really matter? So if I eat one less hamburger each week, is this going to have an impact? How do I, among a world of almost 8 billion people, actually make a difference? That's a really good question. So two parts to that. First of all, it's said, which I don't know if I believe this or not, but the average individual makes about 35,000 decisions on a daily basis. So imagine if you placed a climate action lens over even a small percentage of these actions. So what you eat, how you're going to take transit, where you're going to shop, where you'll buy. So seeing this through a climate lens and potentially taking actions based on this could potentially really impact your individual impact on climate change. But again, you are just one person. But remember, you have a whole network of people, and people that you interact with on a daily basis are watching your actions. They see what you do, they see the decisions that you make, and this can actually have a major influence on other people. So there's a reason why companies pay, for instance, YouTube influencers to wear their clothes or drive their cars. They know that people are more likely to follow the preferences of those that they aspire or emulate to be like. So imagine if, for instance, Kylie Jenner decided that she was going to do meatless Mondays and announce that on her Twitter or Instagram, however she reaches her millions of followers. Imagine what an impact that could potentially have. So while most of us probably don't have that same sphere of influence as Kylie, your actions still significantly impact the decisions of others. And I show some research here that shows that people really decide how they want to act based on what they're seeing other people in society do. That's just natural human nature. So indeed, your individual actions really do make a difference. So remember, it's really not about you. So it's really about us as a society and what your role in shaping what that looks like is. So it might start with you buying a Prius, and then coworkers buy a Prius, and you have this Bay Area problem where you are in a parking lot and you can't find your Prius because there's 100 Priuses that look just like yours. But then what happens is Toyota starts noticing, well, people are buying a lot more Priuses, there's a lot more demand. So we're going to increase production of Priuses, expanding their electric fleet in general. And then this is really the most important part, is where it's followed by policy actions by local, state, and federal governments, like what we just heard in the last two speakers' talks, where you have this wide scale impact. So it really starts with individual efforts to impact all layers, and the individual part is a small but really critical part in this process of making these policy decisions to impact climate change positively. Okay, so what can you do? I'm going to go through these slides a little quickly so that we have enough time for Q&A. But the good news is you're doing part of what you should be doing. So participating in events like Earth Week, and we have a whole host of things here at Cal State East Bay that you can get involved in. This is really important because you get informed, you gain knowledge, you're supporting climate change related activities, and most importantly, again, you're showing your university and your community that climate change is important. Showing your support, so participating in marches, spreading knowledge about climate change, and amplifying voices of individuals who speak up about climate change, whether it's celebrities who speak up on climate change, or activists who play a really important role in their communities. Normalizing this conversation about climate change is really where you start to make a difference and start this cascading effect of influencing people, businesses, companies, and our government into taking action. In terms of amplifying voices, we are really most powerful when we speak collectively as one voice. There's a lot of organizations that help you speak collectively as one voice and also connect with other people who are passionate about climate change. So I'd really encourage you to look into some of these organizations as well as others. And then my last two slides are just getting involved with policy. So find out what's going on here on Cal State East Bay campus here. We have a lot going on in terms of sustainability and climate change activities. Find out what's going on in Hayward, find out what's going on where in the city where you live, and find out how you can support and elevate those actions. And then as I already mentioned, there's a lot of high impact actions that we can take as a society. So learning about what is happening in the policy landscape, things like the Paris Agreement, finding out what political candidates support climate change and have take action, dedicated to taking action on climate change, and vote for those individuals. And again, you have a lot of influence with your money too. So finding out which companies have climate-friendly actions versus those that don't, and support companies with your money. Remember that politicians and companies react to the constituents and the consumers that support them. So use your voice, your actions, and your money to make it clear what we value as a society, and social policies will follow. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there. And since I'm the last speaker, I will take this moment to thank the Office of Sustainability for hosting this wonderful event, and my two co-panelists for their fantastic talks, and of course, all of you for attending this event. So I look forward to the Q&A session. I also have my contact information here if anybody wants to follow up with questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. We would love to hear from you. There was a question that I got sent earlier. I think this is for Professor Wing, and it was, what was the rebuttal for the Keystone Pipeline? Like, why did it take us so long to be able to stop and halt the construction on it?
Well, it was pretty quick. I mean, like Obama had halted it almost immediately. I am unfamiliar with the original pipeline, what and why that was being built, but Obama put a stop to as much as he could. Trump changed it, and then literally day one, Biden revoked it.
I hope that answered their question. I have another question here. It said, how will administrations go about restoring those monuments that Professor Bello talked about? And are those damages even reversible? Do we just have to go on, like, I don't know, mass plant trees for like national parks and stuff? How do we go about that?
Are you talking about restoring the national monuments?
Like restoring monuments in the national parks, I think they meant.
Sure. Yeah, that was something that I had touched on. It's an executive action. So Biden is doing that right now. Although, again, he hasn't signed it just immediately yet because they were looking to restore more. I'd like to make them larger. So you don't just do that like willy-nilly. You look to see what the exact boundaries would be. But that's coming out any day now. But it's just an executive action. And so Obama created a lot more national monuments. We can expect Biden to create more. And again, we're using that to preserve a lot of natural areas. And it can be done very, very quickly and easily.
Climate change and environmental protection is not a 4-year issue, like you've been mentioning. You know, anytime a new administration comes in, they'll change things up. So what possibilities exist to ensure that the protections aren't changed every time a new president comes in?
That would need to be congressional law. So to undo a congressional law, you have to pass a whole nother law. Our Congress doesn't act that fast. The thing about executive orders is that, like you were saying, like one president can enact something and the next president can change it, and then back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So if you want more stability, we need to pressure Congress to change the laws. And right now we are in a good place with the balance in the House and in the Senate and with Biden to actually get laws put into place. And those, again, they have a lot more staying power. They can be changed, but again, it's hard to get all of Congress on board to revoke or totally change a law.
If I could add to that, I think that's 100% correct. But if we could, I'm thinking about even beyond that, other office holders that don't have the same 4-year time frame. So Congress for sure, but state level politicians, just mass public opinion, right? That we as voters, there's so many other things that we can do to keep climate change and other environmental issues on the forefront. And so Congress has to deal with it. Presidents have to focus on it. So there's a lot that we can all do, even if we're not working for the president or in Congress.
Yeah.
I think Professor Schmeltz has his hand raised.
Yes, I had a question for Professor Bello. Thinking about the international agreements, and you had mentioned that they were very they're non-binding, right? So how do we go about making them more binding, or what can the US or other countries do to really sort of get confirmation that their action is actually going to be done? And is there examples of this previously in the international community that we can sort of think about?
So fantastic question, which is really at the crux of international relations and everything that I study, right? That getting, because there's no world government, you can't force anyone to do anything, right? But these agreements have to be somewhat weak, otherwise nobody's going to sign on to them. So you have the climate regime has to make that determination. Is if it's really strong, no one will sign on. If it's too weak, it's not going to do anything. So a couple different ideas are, like I mentioned, the minilateral or bilateral agreements that 2 countries agree with each other that they will do something, and they will be more likely to hold each other accountable. Or 3 or 4 or a smaller region, they are better able to hold each other accountable. The EU is a great example of that, where they have their own emissions trading scheme. It's unique because they have their own supranational level of government, but they're trying to hold each other accountable. And the other probably weaker answer is social pressure works. If you can praise countries for doing a good job, if you can elevate their leaders and talk about what a good job they're doing, provide, spoils in the form of like increased tourism, or, which then has its own environmental problems too, right? But there's efforts afoot to really elevate those that are leading and put them kind of on pedestals to help. So it's similar to how we operate, what Dr. Lam was talking about, peer pressure, watching what your friends do, learning from each other is a lot of what we have to work with, because we can't force anyone to do anything. Particularly the bigger countries that are emitting the most are the least likely to want to do anything you tell them to do.
There's another side question here. Have the accords or climate agreements thus far accomplished anything? Because it feels like we're in the same place we were 30 years ago.
Yeah, this is where I tend to get a little pessimistic. I think in terms of public attention and push for it, that has changed markedly in the last decades. So I'm hoping that that will spur a lot more movement, but not a lot in terms of reductions has really happened. Countries still can't reduce enough, right, that scientists have determined would be enough to stave off any massive increase of the climate. Any major accomplishments? There are. So one of the things that was written to the Kyoto Protocol, there are ways that countries can cooperate with each other. So a country that has more money can essentially buy, it's controversial, but you can buy credits, kind of carbon credits, by working on a project in another country. And there have been some kind of individual projects that have been greener. been focusing on green energy, renewable energy, things like that. I would say that most of the advancements are really on more of a local level, sub-national level, that have really been pushing. And so one of the, and this goes back to Dr. Schmelz's question, is that if we can create some of that momentum, lower levels of government, to tell our federal governments, our national governments, hey, this isn't going to be so devastating to reduce your emissions, right? We can make it more appealing for them, and maybe they're more likely to do so. So I'm not 100% glass full empty, but I'm still fairly pessimistic on getting that national level, the major emitting countries to make huge, like the changes that we need, but I think there are changes happening.
There's another question in the chat, and they're asking, are there any environmental impacts every time we go about canceling projects like the pipeline, and how much budget might be lost, if you might know? This is for any of the panelists.
I can try and respond to that. I don't have any exact number about budgetary losses, although it would change from administration to administration, but certainly within the hundreds of millions. But it switches a lot, because keep in mind that the pipeline, for the most part, there was was a private company wanting to build that, although governmental subsidies were involved, and it was split between the US and Canada. But then also realize that it's not like the US changes its environmental policy drastically from president to president to president to president. What we really saw was a severe and drastic and noticeable change with the Trump administration, where the United States policy had been more in line with increasing environmental protections and increasing environmental protections. And then Trump dramatically pulled it back. And then Biden's just bringing us back to Obama era regulations, and then possibly increasing. So it's not so much of an idea that we're losing money with each administration, because this is sort of an anomaly. It doesn't normally happen like this. But again, I haven't seen any actual numbers as what money was invested because of Trump's rollbacks that we are now reinstating.
There's another question here that is asking that climate change can reach a point of no return, and how do scientists know that we've reached this point and that what we've done up until now is irreversible? There was some talk about 2.5 degrees, 3-degree increase. You could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think that the IPCC has addressed this in their report. So their most recent report was in 2014. I think they have a new one coming out slated for 2022 or 24. So, sometime in the next couple of years. So there'll be an update to what the climate data is showing. I think there is some debate in the community if we have indeed reached that point of no return. I think some scientists are of the point of view that we have already reached it. And even if we basically eliminated all our greenhouse gas emissions today, that, we're kind of, think of it as like a high-speed train where we're trying to slam on the brakes, but that train is going to keep moving for a while down the railroad until we can actually finally get it to stop. So a lot of scientists say we're kind of on this high-speed train, and even if we took drastic action today, a lot of these impacts that we're seeing in the climate around in the US and around the world is basically here to stay. And so there's a lot of focus thinking about climate mitigation, so trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and switch over from fossil fuels to renewable energies, but also thinking about climate adaptation too. So we do need to think as a society, if these extreme weather events are here to stay, how do we make more resilient communities? How do we make resilient crops and livestock so that we can deal with the impacts of climate change? Because I think many of those are here to stay for some time until we can really get our emissions down to a much, much lower level than where we are currently.
I'll just add briefly that all the new treaties are really starting to address adaptation more. The earlier ones, the 92, 97, was all about mitigation, and now it's almost an acceptance. We need to adapt, and so they're trying to do both of those kind of tracks simultaneously, primarily because the most vulnerable countries are finally being listened to and being heard, having a more of a voice and recognize it's not just mitigation, it's mitigation and adaptation that are both necessary.
I want to quickly be mindful of anyone's time. It's almost 1:30. If you want to stay on a little bit longer, you are more than welcome if your questions haven't been answered yet. But I've put a plug in our chat for our post-event survey. We'd love to hear back from you. Tell us what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong and what you'd like to see from us. I've also linked our Earth Week calendar here. We've got a bunch of events lined up for this week, so check them out if you get the chance. Please be sure to follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to stay updated. Our club handle is Sustain East Bay for all those platforms. Thank you everyone for coming. And if we could have a round of applause for our panel.